Welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago's Sunday platform. The platform is virtual while the building remains closed. When the time is right, we will resume our in-person gatherings. We're glad you could be here on a very gray Chicago morning, and look forward to spending the next hour and a half with you. We typically start with a song or humanist reading, and since no one wants to hear me sing, I thought I'd share some thoughts from Paul Kurtz, former editor of the Humanist magazine, in his book, In Defense of Secular Humanism. The first principle of democratic secular humanism is its commitment to free inquiry. We oppose any tyranny over the mind of man, any efforts by ecclesiastical, political, ideological, or social institutions to shackle free thought. In the past, such tyrannies have been directed by churches and states attempting to enforce the edicts of religious bigots. In the long struggles of the history of ideas, established institutions, both public and private, have attempted to censor inquiry, to impose orthodoxy on beliefs and values, and to excommunicate heretics and extirpate unbelievers. Today, the struggle for free inquiry has assumed new forms. Sectarian ideologies have become the new theologies that use political parties and governments in their mission to crush dissent opinion. Free inquiry entails recognition of civil liberties as integral to its pursuit. That is, a free press, freedom of communication, and the right to organize opposition parties and join voluntary associations, and freedom to cultivate and publish the fruits of scientific, philosophical, artistic, literary, moral, and religious freedom. So with that, I got to use the word extirpate, which is very rare for a Sunday. I'm Katie Merrill, a longtime member of the Society. And for those of you who are new to us, our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation, Keeping the Press Free, Attacks on Journalism at Home and Abroad, is at the intersection of several of our major themes, including current events, politics, and social justice. Today's speaker, Michael Dora, is Washington Advocacy Manager at the Committee to Protect Journalists. He leads efforts to advance press freedom around the world with U.S. government and other policymakers. Michael is a humanist, and prior to joining CPJ, he was the Director of Government Affairs and the main representative to the United Nations at the Center for Inquiry, whose mission is to foster a secular society based on reason, science, and freedom. And freedom of inquiry and humanist values. Michael was twice a president of the United Nations NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief in New York. Before he gets started, I just want to remind people how this works. After his presentation, we will have a brief interlude, and you'll be able to enter your questions in the YouTube chat to the right of the presentation screen. But at this point, I'd like to just welcome Michael and look forward to hearing his talk. Thanks.
Thank you. And it was a wonderful and very nice introduction, which I appreciate. And I also appreciate being invited to speak with your community this morning. It's also rainy and gray here where I am. Normally I'd be in Washington, D.C., but due to the pandemic and the fact that everyone's working remotely, I'm in Western New York right now at a little cottage on Lake Erie. So it's actually quite nice that it's so gray out so we can sit here and have a chat with each other. As was mentioned in the introduction, for the past 3.5 years, I've worked for the Committee to Protect Journalists as their Washington Advocacy Manager. The Committee to Protect Journalists is an independent press freedom research and advocacy organization. When I say independent, I say that to stress that we do not take any government funding whatsoever, and we think that that helps kind of protect our independence and our ability to speak out on press freedom issues. Now, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time during my remarks discussing the challenges that journalists face around the world. But I'd first like to note, as was noted in the introduction, that I am in fact a humanist. And furthermore, it turns out that my first speaking engagement, when I went back and looked as I was writing my remarks, was at the New York Society for Ethical Culture for one of their platform services in 2009. At the time, I was 27 years old, and I was invited to speak about the importance of the humanist community cultivating youth within the community. So more than a decade later now, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you here this morning. I'm thinking that in the next decade or so, I should probably try to excrete my speaking experience with the humanist groups westward and get all the way to the West Coast. Now, at the time of the 2009 speech that I gave at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, as was mentioned, I was working in an organization called the Center for Inquiry. Some of you may know it. It's an organization that promotes secular government and humanist values. As it happens, Paul Kurtz, whose quote was read at the outset of this event, was the founder of that organization, along with a number of other entities. And I was fairly close with Paul Kurtz at the beginning of my tenure there. I ended up spending 8 years at the Center for Inquiry, working in a variety of different capacities. It was a small nonprofit trying to punch above its weight. So you had a lot of people there who were working on a lot of different things and taking on different challenges and activities that may have been outside their job mandates. But that's the kind of spirit of the organization had. For the final 5 years, I was the organization's government affairs director. So this meant I was in charge with developing and executing the organization's advocacy strategy in the United States and around the world. But on a very practical level, it meant attending sessions of the UN Human Rights Council, going up to New York to work with other organizations in New York on human rights at the UN there, meeting with members of Congress and the administration, tracking relevant political developments, writing policy briefs, and the kinds of action alerts you get when an organization is trying to tell you that you should contact your member of Congress, tell them to vote one way or the other. And it was all of this work that led me to the Committee to Protect Journalists. It was a colleague of mine who said, hey, I know that you like what you're doing at the Center for Inquiry, but the Committee to Protect Journalists has created this new position leading up all their advocacy in Washington, and you seem like a perfect fit for it. So I jumped right at it. At the beginning of my career, I was a journalist. I studied journalism in school, and so it kind of felt like coming full circle where I started my career as a journalist, turned to human rights advocacy, and now I'm doing human rights advocacy on behalf of journalists, and there's nothing I'd rather be doing. Now, to be sure, freedom of the press is different from the issues that I worked at the Center for Inquiry, but there are quite a few similarities. Here in the United States and in many international human rights documents, the freedoms of the press, religion, belief, and expression are huddled under the same groupings of rights, whether it's the First Amendment or different articles of UN human rights documents. This is to say that when people think of conscience-based rights, freedom of conscience-based rights, they tend to include the press along with religion, belief, and expression. That's not because they're all the same. It's just because they're all linked. For many people, the press is the avenue through which they express their beliefs and opinions in written word. And now with the advent of so many different technological platforms in a number of different ways. But the similarities extend. Many of the countries that restrict freedom of the press also restrict freedom of belief and expression. So a lot of the countries I was working on at the Center for Inquiry, including Saudi Arabia, a country I've done a lot of work on, is also a country that we're really concerned about at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Many of the countries, similarly, that criminalize blasphemy also criminalize journalism. Many of the countries that imprison journalists also imprison atheists and humanists and religious dissidents, often under the same exact laws. Many of the people who come under attack for their views were expressing views about religion and were authors and journalists. So in some cases, there's a lot of overlap between the kinds of work that the Center for Inquiry is doing on their behalf and the kind of work that we're doing on their behalf. And another similarity is that many of the best ways to help to advocate for and to protect religious dissidents are also the best ways to protect journalists who are in similarly dangerous situations. Now, there are all these similarities, but I would like to spend some time talking about the specific threats that exist to journalists around the world. Just a brief bit about the Committee to Protect Journalists first, though, to kind of frame some of what I'm going to talk about. The Committee to Protect Journalists was founded in the 1980s by journalists who were in the United States and who had been traveling around the world to work on stories. And when going to countries around the world, were speaking with local journalists about and learning about the dangers that those journalists face. And there was a lot of concern that those journalists did not enjoy the same protections that journalists in the United States enjoyed. And so journalists who were based here in the US started this organization called the Committee to Protect Journalists. And the initial idea was really for the organization to be a reporting organization that would report on attacks against journalists that are happening around the world. And the core of the organization still exists. And it is, I think, one of the most important, if not the most important aspect of the organization, our research. All of our research that we publish on the website is rigorously combed through by editors and fact-checked and double-sourced. We publish hundreds of different pieces on the website every year in the forms of news alerts and blog posts and special reports to provide a kind of snapshot, an idea of what journalists are facing around the world. Also, to use those news publications to as kind of tools to inform policymakers about the kinds of things that journalists around the world are facing. Now, at the end of every year, we go through all the things that we publish on the website, and we do a huge census, and we try to determine the number of journalists who were imprisoned in that year and the number of journalists who were killed in the line of duty. And these reports are broken down in a number of different ways. They're broken down by region, they're broken down by country, they're broken down by beat, the kind of charge that the journalist is facing, the kind of work that journalists are doing, whether they were photojournalists or print journalists. And these reports represent a significant effort by our researchers and editors. Now, unfortunately, I can't give you a sneak peek because our annual census does come out in mid to late December. So we're actually a few weeks out from those things. The new census is coming out for the year 2020, but under tight wrap. So even I don't know exactly what the numbers are going to be yet. But I do have the numbers from our last census, and I want to go through some of them because I think they do paint a pretty startling picture as to the situation journalists face around the world. In 2019, for the fourth consecutive year, the Committee to Protect Journalists found that there were at least 248 journalists imprisoned globally. China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt were the leading jailers of journalists, and combined, those countries jailed more than half of all the journalists who were behind bars around the world. Now, two interesting pieces of data that I picked out from our census of imprisoned journalists last year. 98% of them were locals imprisoned by their own governments. That is to say that they were not journalists who were working for CNN or MSNBC or the New York Times and who were going somewhere to cover a story. They were overwhelmingly local journalists who work for small newspapers who don't enjoy the same sorts of protections that major media market journalists might enjoy by virtue of the fact that they have a legal arm, attached to the New York Times that will defend them. So they're the most at-risk journalists. Speaking of most at-risk journalists, the beat that was most likely to land journalists in prison was politics, followed by human rights. If you're curious about this, the basic point is that covering political corruption is a pretty dangerous beat, and it puts you in the crosshairs of a number of different people who are in power and who might want to prevent your story from being published or from you continuing to dig into what you're digging. Another thing to note about imprisoned journalists is that being released is sometimes not all that it's cracked up to be. So you can go on the website and look through all the different journalists who were imprisoned in 2019, but just to pick out one case that illustrates what I'm talking about here, there's a photojournalist in Egypt who goes by the name Shao Khan, and this is a case CPJ has been working on for a long time. He was imprisoned for more than 5 years for photographing demonstrations and protests that were happening in Egypt. And the Committee to Protect Journalists and a number of other organizations were advocating on his case for years. Finally, it was announced that he would be released, but not completely released. In fact, Shao Khan was ordered to return to the police station and spend a night in prison every single night, where he'd be observed and, from the reports that we've received, abused by police. In this case, authorities have effectively rendered his release from prison obsolete. Now, in terms of the threat to journalists in terms of their physical safety, in our annual census, we found that there were at least 25 journalists killed last year in relation to their work. This was the lowest figure that we've had since 2002, and you might be curious why that is. It's difficult exactly for us to pinpoint all the different reasons why less journalists are killed, but I do think that there is a correlation when you look at the graph, the number of killed journalists over the years and how that correlates with the level of armed conflict in the world. And so I think when you see a dip in armed conflict and wars, you tend to see a dip in the number of journalists who are killed. Now, 10 of those 25 journalists were killed were in direct reprisal for their reporting. That is to say that they were murdered. And probably the most disturbing statistic that I've ever come across in all the press freedom work that I've been doing is that the Committee to Protect Journalism research shows that in nearly about 87%, nearly 9 out of 10 cases of murdered journalists, the killers go unpunished. Nobody ever gets punished for the crime, and this is a really dangerous phenomenon because murder is the ultimate form of censorship. The murderers are seeking to kill a story by killing a person, and impunity for those murders sends a rather empowering message to those who seek to censor and control the media through violence. It has a chilling effect as well on journalists who see that their government and their society will not protect them when people come and target them for murder. So those censuses represent a sort of overview of the dangers that we see journalists facing around the world. But I did want to pick up on a few patterns or themes that we've seen in the data, and we've tried to kind of separate out and look at the different threats that exist to journalists to make sense of them. I think the most common way that governments seek to censor journalists or attack the press is simply by criminalizing the act of journalism, making it a crime to be a journalist or to engage in acts of journalists. We have documented several ways that governments employ this strategy, and I think the most prevalent of them is the use of national security or anti-terror laws that they use to justify crackdowns on the press. So remember just a moment ago, I spoke about the 248 journalists behind bars in our 2019 census. The majority of them, around 70%, face anti-state charges. These include belonging to or aiding groups that authorities have deemed to be terrorist organizations. To give you an example, there's a journalist in Cameroon whose name is Ahmed Abba. And Abba was working for Radio France Internationale when he was arrested in 2015 after leaving the press briefing of a local governor. He was held without a lawyer and was questioned about the activities of the extremist sect Boko Haram. Now, why was this happening? Well, Ahmed had reported on attacks carried out by Boko Haram and actually had contact with the group. He spoke to several of the members to write his story. So he's being questioned. He's eventually charged with complicity in acts of terrorism and failure to denounce acts of terrorism, and later sentenced to 10 years in prison. Thanks to tireless advocacy by lawyers, by local and international groups such as ours, he was eventually freed on appeal and even came to the United States a couple of years ago to accept an award from the Committee to Protect Journalists. But his story puts on display the lengths to which government officials will go to paint journalists as terrorists if they see that as productive toward their end of censoring any information that would be perceived as critical of their administration or their government. Now, in Abba's case, he was charged under a 2014 anti-terrorism law. And it's often the case, I say that because it's a relatively new law, and it is often the case that criminalization is accompanied by surging anti-press rhetoric that lays the groundwork for, builds popular support for legal restrictions. In fact, it's no coincidence that states that have moved past fake news laws, those leaders are on record already delegitimizing critical news and reporting under the guise of charging them with fake news. And I want to spend a moment on fake news because this is one of the biggest problems that I think journalists and news organizations are facing right now. There is definitely a trend of increased passage and use of what we call false news statutes to jail journalists. In 2019, we found that the number of journalists jailed or in jail charged with false news allegations rose to 30, which was compared with 28 in 2018. Now, that's not a huge climb, but in 2012, that's when CPJ started tracking this. There was only one journalist in prison for a false news allegation. So we're definitely seeing more and more countries pass false news statutes and use them to put journalists in prison. And the more that we see political leaders around the world use fake news as a barb to poke at the news media, the more this will become acceptable around the world. And that's something that the Committee to Protect Journalists right now is really concerned about. Now, even in robust democracies, notably the United States, elected officials do accuse legitimate news organizations and journalists of being fake news. Now, some democracies, I think, like the United States, have strong institutions and have resisted most of the legal threats to reporting that may ensue from increasing charges of fake news against journalists. But the rhetoric itself is deeply concerning. It undermines public confidence in the media, and that can open the door to legal restrictions down the road. I think it also inspires threats to journalists and media outlets. We've seen a number of cases of U.S. media outlets coming under threat and having to increase their security apparatuses. But worse, in my opinion, it empowers autocratic dictatorial leaders around the world who are hungry for justifications to justify their own repressive media policies, and now see leaders in the United States using it, a place that was supposed to be a beacon of press freedom. And so they can just kind of point to the president and say, well, the president of the United States says journalists are fake news, so what we're doing here is completely in compliance with kind of the global norms right now. Now, direct attacks on the press don't always work. And in some cases, governments and individual actors sometimes opt to attack journalists through a variety of different legal mechanisms. These include charging journalists with financial crimes, with criminal defamation, under laws that prohibit reporting on public officials whatsoever, defamation laws, the list goes on. The probably most illustrative case of this is the case of Maria Ressa, who's a U.S. citizen who attended Princeton, has been journalist in Asia for more than 30 years, some of them as CNN's bureau chief in Manila and then Jakarta. Maria is in the Philippines right now. She's the founder, CEO, and executive editor of an organization called Rappler. And Rappler is a Philippine news website she created in 2012. It's renowned for its critical coverage of President Rodrigo Duterte, his controversial actions and policies, reporting on political corruption and human rights in the country. And as you can probably guess, as a result of reporting on those kinds of things, she's gotten in a lot of trouble, as has Rappler. In fact, Rappler and Maria have faced dozens of lawsuits over the years for their reporting, some of which Maria is still in court battling. In one case, just to give you an example of the kinds of things she's facing, recently she was convicted of cyber libel, and I think she was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. So we're kind of in the appeals process right now. But just to explain the case, she was convicted of cyber libel due to an article that was published on Rappler in May 2012, in which a businessman was linked to a drug trafficking and human trafficking allegations that was based on an intelligence report that Rappler had gotten. The law under which Maria was charged was passed years after the article was published. So the law that they're using to prosecute her for the information that she published was something that they did ad hoc as a way to go after her. And again, this goes to show the lengths to which governments will go to stifle journalists and prevent the press from reporting on things that they believe to be unsavory. Elections and election-related violence against journalists is another theme that we've seen in our data and our reporting. We have found that elections are a very dangerous time for journalists. Autocrats and dictators who are seeking to control narratives around an upcoming election will often seek to censor the press, seek to censor what they can publish, and punish news organizations and journalists who cross a perceived line. Now, they may be doing this to control narratives leading up to an election. They may be doing it to carry out an election under false pretenses and to get away with things so that no one else can see them. To just give you one example, ahead of elections in Cambodia last year, the Information Ministry ordered local internet service providers to block 17 websites, including Radio Free Asia, which is a U.S. Congress-funded news outlet. It ordered all of them to halt their website activity for 48 hours ahead of the election because their coverage was deemed to be provocative and political. Now, threats to journalists during elections are especially intense when campaigns are marked by protests and violence. Journalists covering unrest related to elections often find themselves caught between protesters and law enforcement officials in a relatively dangerous place because neither of those sides are really looking at them saying we should protect those journalists, especially when violence breaks out. So one of the things that CPJ has been doing is advocating with governments ahead of elections to ensure that they do not crack down on the press, and that ahead of elections, other governments are pressuring them to keep the press open and keep the internet on in their countries. I also want to speak a little bit about technology and social media. Technology has had a complex impact on reporting. On the one hand, the advent of smartphones and social media has allowed individuals to immediately publish evidence of human rights violations or corruption to millions of people around the world immediately. The advance of protected communication services such as Telegram and Signal and WhatsApp has also allowed activists and sources to connect more safely with journalists and advocates to speak with them about what they're seeing, in the local place. But there are still a number of issues that exist despite these progresses, and one of them is that they've allowed, particularly social media platforms, so that anonymous members of society, very often backed by governments, can log on, create profiles, and use those social media platforms to aggressively harass and threaten journalists. This is a problem that's particularly acute for female journalists. One recent example to give you a sense of what female journalists are often dealing with on these platforms concerns a Brazilian journalist by the name of Patricia Campos Melo, and we actually had her in the United States last year at our awards ceremony. In Brazil, in the course of the work she was doing, a former employee of a digital marketing company gave a statement that attacked her and suggested that she lied in her reporting and accused her of essentially trading sex for information. Now, this is a smear that women journalists often face, and it wasn't surprising. However, following the testimony, Campos Melo received hundreds of harassing messages on social media, and even worse, several politicians, including the son of the president of Brazil, Eduardo Bolsonaro, shared and repeated the allegations on Twitter. And so now hundreds of users on Facebook and Twitter are posting memes about her, sexually illicit language and visuals. And every time she logs onto Twitter and Facebook, she now has to deal with this. So this is something that we're deeply concerned about and trying to do more reporting on and more engagement with social media platforms to combat this sort of thing. A related technological threat to journalists is spyware. Moving beyond social media, the increasing digital nature of our lives paired with a relatively unregulated market on global technology has allowed governments to effectively surveil and spy on journalists. So you may be aware of what spyware is, but just to give you a kind of brief summary of it, spyware is designed to infect phones without being detected. That's the point of it. And typically a victim is sent a text message that spoofs a legitimate text. There was actually one that I almost clicked on recently, but it's a good thing I did a quick Google search about it. I got a message about some package that USPS was trying to deliver to me. Well, it looked a little off, and then I thought about it for a moment. I said, I don't think I have any package that would be delivered through USPS. And I Googled the text of the text message, and it was definitely spyware. And this is the sort of thing that journalists are dealing with all over the world. So, if I would have clicked that link, I don't know what would have been on the other end. But in a lot of cases of journalists who are victims of spyware, the person who is behind the spyware is now one loading the spyware onto the device, and now has almost full access to the smartphone. So you can monitor the target's activity. You can see what they're doing. You may even be able to remotely activate the target's camera and microphone to conduct surveillance on the target. Sadly, as technology continues to advance, the technology is becoming increasingly sophisticated and therefore very hard to detect. Some tools can even allow users to take control of a journalist's smartphone without the journalist even taking any action. So there's no spoof message. The smartphone is just compromised through some other form. There are a lot of different forms of spyware, but probably the most advanced and popular tool is something called Pegasus, which is sold by an Israeli firm called NSO Group, which is actually part of a UK-based massive capital firm. Now, the challenge, as I said, is that this stuff is really hard to detect and trace. And a lot of people who are subjected to surveillance don't even know that they're under surveillance. But the public record is very disturbing. Companies across Europe and the Middle East are developing and selling spyware to governments and other actors who have records of press freedom violations, and they are using those tools to target journalists. That's what we have found in our research. Pegasus, just to give you one example of the kind of issue that we're seeing here with one type of spyware, Pegasus has been detected in more than 45 countries, and it's been linked to the targeting of journalists in India, Mexico, Uganda, Lebanon, Morocco, and the UAE. We have been doing a lot of research on this and are working on a spyware project internally right now. But there's an excellent organization at the University of Toronto called Citizen Lab. And if you really want to read more about this, you can go to Citizen Lab, the Citizen Lab website, and they do remarkable reporting and essentially detective work to try to, figure out who is behind these spyware attacks, who are the companies involved, who are the targets, and what is actually going on behind the scenes here. So I would definitely recommend that you check out Citizen Lab and learn more about this. But I also wanted to speak about a related issue. Many governments around the world also have a lot of authority at borders to search the electronic devices of journalists and activists. And this includes the United States, disturbingly, where the Committee to Protect Journalists has reported on how Customs and Border Patrol agents have tracked journalists, pulled aside journalists at borders while they're crossing into the United States to search their electronic devices, to ask them invasive questions about their reporting. Sometimes we think in an effort by the police to essentially gather information about the stories that journalists are working on, the sources that they're speaking with. And we've also seen a number of cases of CBP agents being quite aggressive towards journalists at borders, which may be related to some of the increasingly sharp rhetoric we've seen towards journalists in recent years. So this is another issue that the Committee to Protect Journalists is working on really closely. I will say that in the last couple of years, this work is somewhat stalled. We had a series of meetings with the Department of Homeland Security. We had met with Congress on a number of different occasions, and this is just not an issue that anyone has really seized within the United States, except for us right now and the ACLU and a couple of other organizations. But it's a really serious issue. Now, I would like to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about the state of press freedom in the United States, and kind of give you a snapshot of what's happening here in the U.S. The Committee to Protect Journalists' work is traditionally focused outside of the United States, which is born out of a recognition that the dangers that journalists face outside the United States are significantly worse than what the dangers that journalists face in the United States. But it's not either or black and white. And in fact, in recent years, the Committee to Protect Journalists has increased its focus on the state of press freedom in the United States out of recognition that there are increasing threats to press freedom here. Now, to be fair, threats to the press in the United States are not new. They actually extend all the way back to the founding of the nation. Throughout U.S. history, elected officials and leaders of nearly all political traditions have attacked and championed the press. In 1798, a decade after the signing of the U.S. Constitution and its First Amendment, the Federalist dominated Congress passed, and Federalist President John Adams signed the Sedition Act of 1798. This was a law that criminalized false statements critical of the government. And one of the supposed goals was to quiet pro-Jefferson newspapers ahead of the 1800 election. Well, it didn't work. Adams lost to Jefferson, who was known for many things, including his robust defense of civil liberties. In fact, when he took office, he pardoned everyone convicted under the Sedition Act. However, Jefferson himself was not a huge fan of news publications at the time. And this was in part due to some of the allegations that were printed in newspapers critical of him leading up to the 1800 election and under his presidency. And so just to give you an historical example, in 1807, Jefferson writes this letter, and he writes, quote, "It's a melancholy truth that a suppression of the press could not more completely deprive the nation of its benefits than is done by its abandoned prostitution to falsehood. Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle." These are sharp words about newspapers from the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence and has always spoken about freedom of the press. He actually suggested to a newspaper editor once that the newspaper editor should actually reform the newspaper and divide it into 4 chapters: truths, probabilities, possibilities, and lies. Now, I've done a little research on this as someone who studied political theory and history, and according to some historians, during his second term, Jefferson even urged several state attorney generals in New England to prosecute newspaper editors for sedition, for their criticism of his administration. So, it's interesting here because Adams and Jefferson, both founding fathers, argued for the right to a free press because they knew it was central to keeping an open society alive. But they were also highly critical of newspapers and willing to go after the press to protect or secure their own political goals. Fast forward 2 centuries, and you run past a lot of different presidents with a lot of different positions on the press. But just to give you, a snapshot of the last 2, the Obama administration was notorious for using the Espionage Act to go after alleged journalistic sources. In fact, more than all other administrations combined. It, according to CPJ reporting, spied on reporters' phone records. It successfully sought search warrants for reporters' emails. It aggressively prosecuted leakers of classified information. And it used electronic surveillance programs to deter government sources from speaking to journalists. So, and as I spoke about before, the issue of electronic device searches and the safety of journalists and reporters was also an issue. So there are issues here that have gone on, even under presidents who people think were much friendlier to the press. Now, the Trump administration has stepped up prosecutions of news sources. It's interfered with the business of media owners. It's continued to harass journalists at borders. But I think where we see a real difference in the past is the public criticism of the press. Trump's approach is distinctive. You have, again, global leaders now quoting the president in denying human rights supports and justifying the jailing of journalists. This didn't happen in 1800 or even just 4 or 5 years ago. But truth be told, the threats that exist to journalism extend in the United States far beyond just the legal, far beyond the federal level. The changing nature of how people consume news has left newspapers across the country without advertising income, with dwindling readership. Many of them have had to shut down entirely or else be bought out by other newspapers or firms. More and more, we're seeing local elected officials using attacks on the press to keep journalists and critical questions at bay. And we've also now seen in journalists who are covering Black Lives Matter protests across the country facing both attacks by protesters and by law enforcement. In fact, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is a website that CPJ helped to found as a way to collect information on attacks against journalists in the United States. It's the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, is in the process of documenting about 900 attacks this year against journalists. These include arrests, physical attacks, equipment damage, tear gassing, rubber bullets. And these 900 attacks represent a 600% increase in press freedom violations in the United States this year from last year. So it's a very dangerous time to be a journalist in the United States. Now, all these things happen around the world. What does an organization like the Committee to Protect Journalists do to try to defend the press? Well, there are a variety of different ways that we do it. You have probably all at some point received an email from an organization asking you to fill out an action alert and tell a member of Congress to vote one way on a bill. That's called grassroots advocacy, and it's when an organization has a really strong constituency, tries to activate that constituency for change. We do some of that, but it's somewhat difficult, particularly when your constituents are journalists and are somewhat allergic to wanting to get engaged in partisan politics. So what we focus on is really more of what we call grass tops advocacy. That is, strategic high-level engagement. So based on our reporting that we have on our website, we directly engage with policymakers and start campaigns to free imprisoned journalists, to seek justice in cases of murdered journalists. And as my job title suggests, we do a lot of this in Washington, but I also have a counterpart in Brussels who's doing the same thing with regional European institutions, as well as colleagues who are based in New York and who are engaging with the United Nations and other international bodies. So our advocacy is ongoing and never stops. But even myself, a person who spent the last decade engaged in human rights advocacy, would have to admit that sometimes advocacy does not work. Sometimes placing phone calls to policymakers and trying to get governments and policymakers together to pressure other governments that are imprisoning journalists, sometimes it just doesn't work. In fact, I know this firsthand. When I was working at the Center for Inquiry, I worked very closely with free thinkers and humanists in around the world, in Asia and the Middle East, who were under threat for their beliefs and what they've written. And one of these individuals was a fellow by the name of Avijit Roy, Bangladeshi, who was living in the United States and actually had written for some of the Center for Inquiry's magazines. And in February 2015, he was back in Bangladesh with his wife, visiting a book fair when he was killed in the streets for the books that he had written, for the things he had written. Now, I've been in close contact with Avijit because I knew how, he was basically informing me how bad the situation was in Bangladesh for free thinkers and humanists. And immediately after he was killed, I had people connecting me with free thinkers and humanists in Bangladesh who had written books, who were bloggers, who were now under threat and needed help. And calling the US State Department or calling the Bangladeshi government was only going to get me so far. I mean, calling the Bangladeshi government at that point would have not accomplished anything. Calling the State Department, and maybe a little bit, but it was very clear that these people were in danger and they needed help immediately. And it was not something that you could help them by publishing an action alert on your website or by placing a phone call. So we were having some brainstorming sessions at the organization, and I ended up creating this new program of the organization called the Free Thought Emergency Fund, which is now called Secular Rescue. I left the organization, so they've renamed it. The intent of the program was to provide endangered free thinkers and humanists with essentially the money they needed to protect themselves. So this included paying medical bills if they had been attacked and survived. It included paying for security if they needed a driver to drive them from one place to another, if they wanted to move from one house to the other, if they wanted to leave their country entirely. In some instances, we actually secured fellowships and other employment opportunities. And in fact, several of the individuals that we helped ended up in the United States, and one of whom I've stayed very close with is actually up in New York right now, Columbia, doing graduate school. So it's been really meaningful work. Now, interestingly, the Committee to Protect Journalists has a similar initiative. In fact, in 2017, when I walked into their office for an interview, was the second time I'd been in the office, because I'd been in there in 2015 after seeing all these attacks on Bangladeshi authors and bloggers, to sit down and talk with them about what we could do to work together. Now, the program that the Committee to Protect Journalists has, our emergencies program, is actually both reactive and proactive. At the Center for Inquiry, the program that I started was just reactive. It was helping people who are in dangerous positions. But what the Committee to Protect Journalists tries to do is also be proactive. So when journalists are in dangerous situations, the rising technological threats, we're trying to provide guidance notes to journalists who need it, and particularly freelancers, who are going to be covering dangerous news stories, who are attending protests, or covering an election, or dealing with a pandemic. And so the work of the organization is also proactive to make sure that journalists have the kind of know-how and tools that they need to protect themselves when they're out reporting. So a couple of closing notes. As I've alluded to, there are a number of challenges to our work. From the perspective of my advocacy in Washington, it seems to me that the strength of dictatorial governments and the difficulty that even powerful governments face in reining those governments in is a primary challenge. Geopolitics is another challenge. The situation that we're dealing with Saudi Arabia following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi has been a real challenge because of the way in which some policymakers in Washington view Saudi Arabia as it relates to Iran, and pursuing justice for Jamal and trying to get justice and punish the individuals in Saudi Arabia who were really responsible for his murder is very difficult, because policymakers see this as undoubtedly connected to, you know, a domino effect that it may have and the geopolitical relationships that the United States has. So that's another challenge. And sometimes that means that it takes years to get justice for cases of murder journalists. Jamal Khashoggi was killed in 2018. We're here in 2020, and we're still dealing with his case and not made a ton of progress. So it requires a long-term approach. There's also this other issue, this issue of the smorgasbord of political issues that consistently arise in Washington and around the world. I have literally been sitting in a meeting on Capitol Hill with a member of Congress or with a staff member when something the president said or tweeted is breaking on the news channel that is hanging on the wall, the TV's hanging on the wall, and that's it. The whole meeting blows up because some political development has happened that everyone is now looking at. And it can make keeping everyone focused on the task at hand very difficult. So that's a challenge that really is not related to any sort of policy or the strength of government. It's just like, you know, keeping people focused when there's so much going on. But I don't like to end remarks on a sour note. So I'd like to highlight some of the positive developments and opportunities. First, there's no doubt that the press around the world is more connected than ever before. You know, it is technology that's allowed this. It's allowed journalists to share information across borders so that journalists can build stories together without even having to be in the same room. To give you an example, there was an investigative journalist in Malta whose name was Daphne Caruana Galizia, and she was digging through a lot of unsavory stuff and publishing it on her website. And one morning went out to her car and a bomb went off and killed her, a car bomb. And so there's been a long investigation in Malta. Her family has been remarkable. Her two sons just actually won an award for the advocacy that they're doing on her behalf to seek justice for her. But what about the stories that she was working on? As I said before, when journalists are murdered, very often that's because you have people in power who are trying to control the narrative, control the story, and prevent that information from getting out there. Well, a lot of journalists from all over the world following Daphne's murder, investigative journalists around the world, banded together. They weren't in the same room, but they had internet and they had technology and they had computers and they had secure messaging. So they started working on her stories and have continued to develop the stories that she was working on. So I do think that is a huge positive development. Another positive development that's related is that non-governmental advocacy organizations such as the Committee to Protect Journalists are also more connected than ever. We're able to speak more securely with organizations around the world and work with them in a collaborative fashion. So two last notes that I'd like to close with on a sort of personal level. First, you know, I've spoken to a lot of groups about the state of press freedom around the world and attacks that journalists face. And, you know, one of the questions you always try to get your head around is, why is this happening? Why are governments continuing to do these sorts of things? Why do people attack the press? As someone who studied political theory, so I studied journalism in undergrad, got a master's in political theory, and you know, I can't help but reflect and look at the causes of these activities. And really the simplest explanation I can find is power. It's all about power. It's about maintaining power. It's about keeping power. It's about taking power. It's about ensuring that the journalists don't have the power to publish the information, objective, independent information that they want to publish. Political leaders accuse journalists of being fake news because their reporting is a threat to the power. Religious and political leaders stoke the flames on religious dissent and criticism of religion because dissent and criticism is a threat to their power, their stature in society. And the reason why we need to protect journalists and dissenters is because power can be easily used for tyrannical purposes, and we stand at risk of losing everything we hold dear when that happens. Secondly, leaving the humanist community 3.5 years ago was very difficult for me. I never thought I'd work in an organization where I'm a humanist and I get to defend other humanists around the world. So it was a very meaningful work for me. And there were times when I was at CFI, I thought, I'm going to be in this organization for the rest of my life. Where else is there to go? But time moves on and you find new opportunities. But just because I left the humanist movement doesn't mean that I left my humanism behind. In fact, I think my continued work on human rights is almost entirely due to my humanism, my recognition in the dignity of human beings, of the worth of the very important project that we're all engaged in, that's ensuring that people can exercise their rights and freely choose their beliefs and lead their lives as they wish. Now, as an organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists does not concern itself with religion. Well, we will report on a journalist who comes under attack and is being charged with blasphemy for reporting something in a newspaper. But as an organization, religion doesn't really enter our purview. But I think in a way, you could argue that the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists is humanistic in nature. Journalists around the world are working under the thumbs of dictators and autocrats, facing daily attacks on their livelihoods. We're not looking above for answers to those challenges. We have no faith that progress is inevitable and things will get better. All we know is that hard work in concert with others will bring about change. And that's what we're focused on doing, trying to create a better world for everyone who's here based on tried and true strategies. So thank you again for allowing to speak with you this morning. I'll end my prepared remarks there and happy to take some questions.
Yay. So if we were in a room together, everyone would be clapping. I'm the only one who gets to clap, but I'm clapping on behalf of scores of other people. Thank you so much for your thoughts. I found it really interesting, and the extra hook to humanism just really touched my heart. So thank you. So what's going to happen now is we're going to have a brief interlude, and during which we hope you'll think to make a contribution to the society that helps sustain us and helps us keep our quote unquote doors open, and lets us bring speakers like this to you every Sunday, and hopefully other events once we're allowed to have events. So during the interlude, there will be information about how to donate. You can do it through our website and through some other mechanisms. But it's also a chance to think about collecting your thoughts and your questions. So in the YouTube, you'll see on the right, there's a chat box and you can write your question there. And we will get to as many of those as possible. So in the meantime, just relax, enjoy the music. And if you have $5 or something else to spare to support us, we welcome it. Thank you. So welcome back, and thanks for those of you who gave. I'm grateful, and I think Michael will come back with us here in a sec. And I'm going to start presenting the questions. So the first one that someone submitted actually is akin to one I have. I'm going to augment it a little bit. How is CPJ dealing with evolving definition of who a journalist is? Do they consider bloggers and YouTube streamers to be journalists? How do they define journalists? And I'm going to add to that, how do I discern, I'm going to just provocatively say Fox News journalists from what you might think of as a journalist?
Sure. Well, this is one of the most common questions we get, and it's also an issue that we're engaged with policymakers on. The simple answer is that we don't really focus on trying to nail down a definition of who is a journalist and who is not. Our work as an organization is focused on defending individuals who are engaged in acts of journalism and defending the act of journalism itself. So that means that sometimes the cases that we're reporting on are concerned with individuals who don't work for any news organization and are not attached to a newspaper or anything like that. In fact, they may just run their own blog, but as a result of running their own blog and publishing the information that they published, the government's now coming after them. And I think this is really important for a number of reasons. One of them is that around the world, you know, as I spoke about all these restrictions on the press, sometimes it's people on social media platforms and with their own personal blogs who are the ones who can actually break news because the restrictions that exist on news organizations. So defending those bloggers and people who don't kind of fit what a lot of people think of in their mind as the definition of journalists becomes really important. Recently, I was working with a congressional office, Representative Mark Takano, a representative from California, who had been working on a draft bill, which was now introduced. It's a pretty interesting initiative. The bill would create a reporting mechanism within the DOJ where journalists who face attack in the United States by any law enforcement official can report that to the DOJ. And then the DOJ takes up the case file with the local law enforcement body. And if the law enforcement body does not respond and explain what happened and there's no justice in the case, then a variety of different funding streams are put at risk for those law enforcement bodies as a result of this process. And anyway, really interesting bill, but more on the point here is that they were like asking me, you know, well, how should we define a journalist in the bill? And I said, well, you don't have to. You could just make the bill about any individual in the United States who's engaged in an act of journalism, who's videotaping a protest and trying to post it online, who's writing a blog post, anyone who's engaged in an act of journalism and not, you know, just a card-carrying member of the press should be covered by this. So we ended up having to go back and forth, and they ended up using some language that existed in a different bill that had already been introduced in Congress. But this is a issue that we engage on because there are consequences for the definition of a journalist around the world. The moment that the United States puts into code what a journalist is, it almost certainly means that there are going to be certain people engaged in journalism who are not covered by that definition. It greenlights to other countries around the world that they can start putting into law their own definitions of who is a journalist. And if the United States law they think is good, they may take that one up, but it may be restrictive or to leave out certain individuals. So as an organization, we don't really focus on questions of who is and who is not a journalist, but rather, are they engaged in active journalism? And also, is the journalism that they're doing, fact-based publications? So I hope that answers the question.
So I'm hearing verb, not noun. I should think about doing journalism versus being a journalist as a
Yeah,
distinction.
that's what we try to focus on. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to think verb from now on, even when you use a noun.
Because like right now, I'm not a journalist. I work for a journalist advocacy organization. I don't, write for any newspaper or get paid by any news staff. But if I say wanted to start a blog tomorrow about the little town I'm living in, and I started publishing information about I heard from someone based on this person that there was a backroom deal and there's some political corruption going on in town, and people started coming after me. The important part wouldn't be like, is he a journalist or is he not a journalist? It's like, no, they're going after him because he's engaged in journalism. So that's kind of what we're trying to focus on.
Got it. So the next question from somebody, from one of your listeners, has CPJ taken a position on WikiLeaks and Julian Assange?
Yes, this is another case that we get a lot of questions about, and actually this question fits really well with the question that we just talked about, because one of the constant points of discussion in the Assange case is whether or not he is a journalist, whether or not WikiLeaks is a news organization. And it's worth stressing that you don't have to be a journalist to be protected by the First Amendment right to freedom of the press. And whether or not Assange is a journalist is not really a question that we're concerned with. We're not even sure it's a question that is worth spending a lot of time on, because it doesn't change the fact that what we see as the prosecution of Assange under a variety of different legal pursuits is a real threat to journalists in the United States and around the world. So it's the Assange case for us is as much about consequences as it is anything else. If you have the United States going after organizations that are publishing information and trying to use the Espionage Act, or I think in Assange case they've used the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and gone after him in a number of different ways. This case is really about the legal implications for journalists and news organizations. If Assange can be prosecuted for publishing information, then that there's nothing stopping the U.S. government from then eventually going after the New York Times or the Washington Post or any news organization simply for publishing information. So that's what we've really been focused on in the Assange case, making the point that what happens in the Assange case will have consequences for journalists in the United States and around the world. And we shouldn't lose sight of that in what may be interesting, but maybe not ultimately important debates about whether or not he is a journalist and whether or not WikiLeaks is a real news organization.
This is sort of piggybacks on that, but it's a slightly different vocabulary. I don't know if it raises any different issues. What about whistleblowers? Even people that speak up for attacks on the press seem to support oppressing whistleblowers.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we've been increasingly concerned with at the Committee to Protect Journalists in the last couple of years is the extent to which government agencies and bodies in Washington are disallowing or disabusing potential whistleblowers from reporting on things that they're seeing that they think are wrong, and the challenge that presents to the news media. If we don't allow people who are seeing these horrendous problems within government bodies and other organizations from reporting those problems up a chain, then we're in a really dangerous place, because the situation is never going to change, and the news media is also not going to get the information it needs to report out that these sorts of things are happening. So we've been doing a lot of work to try to speak with government agencies to ensure that they have these policies in place, and that whistleblowers are allowed to report this out. It's not a very big issue for us because the act of whistleblowing itself is not necessarily kind of conceived under the sort of work that we're doing, but it's obviously necessary that whistleblowers are protected so that journalists can report on the information. Now, one of the dangerous things here is that, in the case of Assange, as we were talking about before, you're seeing someone being prosecuted for publishing that information, but you're also seeing, and I mentioned this before with the Obama administration, the government increasingly going after the sources of information, the people who are leaking out to the press. And unfortunately, people probably leak out to the press in certain cases because their own internal whistleblowing mechanisms are not strong enough to allow them to report that up internally. And so they have to go to the press. There's no other option to get this information out there. So it's very important to us to be able to protect the right of people to whistleblow.
The next question is, can you comment on Russia under Putin?
Russia under Putin. So as Washington advocacy manager, I have to be kind of the jack of all trades when it comes to regional expertise. So we have someone who works on that region of the world and does a lot of work on Russia, as you can imagine, one of the more restrictive environments for the press. And I would definitely encourage you to, if you go to cpj.org, you can look at our Russia archives and get a sense of the sort of work that we've done. Under Putin, Russia is one of the most restrictive press freedom environments in the world, and it's a country that we've done a lot of reporting on. I think that the situation in Russia points to something I was talking about before when you're dealing with these geopolitical, very complicated situations. So, we want to improve the press freedom situation in Russia, but, freedom of the press is just one issue in a much larger set of issues that relate to Russia. And so trying to get engagement on that is difficult because when people look at Russia, they see all these issues and how does this one issue fit into it? The other is that, one of the mechanisms we use to try to pressure governments around the world is, I'm based in Washington, so I try to engage with Congress and the administration and say you should be putting out statements or writing a bill about this. And the U.S. doesn't really have much of a authority right now to advocate to Russia. So we have to be creative in how we respond to that. And so, as I mentioned before, we have someone based in Brussels, and he's also engaging with European governments and European institutions. So it's, Russia's a real challenge for us.
When did the term, quote, fake news originate, and how has this damaged the legitimate press?
I'm not sure when it originated. I think if you looked it up, I remember researching this once and seeing that the term was actually a bit older than I thought. So it's not something that was just invented in the last couple of years. But if you look again at the statistics that we've reported and that I spoke about before, and I'll just pull them up really quickly. In 2012, when I think we first started reporting on false news accusations and allegations, and journalists being imprisoned on that basis, there was only one journalist. And now last year we had 30, and it'll be really interesting to see where our numbers are in a couple of weeks when we put our new census of journalists in prison. Because I think that you're no doubt seeing a phenomenon where more and more people are referencing fake news and trying to attack the press. But I'm not sure exactly when the term was invented. It seems like President Trump invented the term himself, given the frequency with which he's used it, but I don't think he did. It's just a really handy term for him because he gets so much critical news coverage that he wants to paint. He actually was out about this completely. I forget which. It was a woman journalist. I'm blanking on who this was, but she was asking him about these fake news allegations that he throws at news organizations all the time, and he essentially said, "I have to do it. I can't have people thinking what you're reporting is true. So I have to use these fake news allegations to smear news organizations. It's a way for me to win. So it's really, really dangerous. And we are trying to do more to combat it. And I think what was really disturbing for me on the fake news thing is that a couple of years ago in 2017, the Committee to Protect Journalists organized what we call a press freedom mission to the United States. So we brought the heads of a bunch of different organizations that are engaged on freedom of expression and freedom of the press to the United States. We sent one group of them to Texas, and we sent another one to Missouri. And they met with local journalists and news organizations, independent, New York Times people, to get a sense of what challenges journalists on the ground in the United States face, get outside of Washington, talk about what those local journalists are facing. And they talked about a lot of the things that I was talking about before. Being at protests is really dangerous. Getting information from local governments can take a long time, freedom of information requests, et cetera, et cetera. But some of them were starting to talk about how they're being called fake news. Like, they're trying to interview some local House representative and walking down the hallway with them. And he's like, I'm not going to talk to you. You're fake news. It's like, the way in which this has trickled down is really disturbing. So I think we all need to be vigilant in fighting back.
So I kind of think this might be the other side of that same coin. So I'm going to jump the order of these questions. How do you deal with journalists who disseminate and promote hate? And I'm going to say and or fake news. Like, what about something that looks like journalism as you conceptualize, or doing journalism as you conceptualize it, but in fact may not be as fact-based as you would like, or is cherry picking facts, right? To maybe sow hate.
Yeah, that's difficult. We have definitely been asked this question a number of times, and the thing is, we don't really, as an organization, engage in questions about quality of journalism. And so, there have no doubt been news organizations and journalists who we've advocated for, who a lot of people would look at and say, why would you defend an organization like that? Actually, when I got interviewed at the Committee to Protect Journalists, there was a sort of question like this from one of the directors, put you in a position where it's like, okay, there's a crew from Fox News in Syria, and they've been kidnapped by Russian aligned forces, or there's a crew from RT, Russia Today, that was taken by Syrian backed forces, and they're being held under threat of death. And are these cases that the Committee to Protect Journalists would take up? And I said, well, yeah, absolutely. I think there are real concerns about the way in which some news organizations, particularly news organizations that are not just funded by governments, but controlled by governments. There's a difference between what the BBC is doing, what NPR is doing, and what RT is doing. And that difference is entirely based on editorial control and not on the funding stream necessarily. But the reality is that the people who work for those organizations consider themselves to be journalists, and they're out there in the field engaging in acts of journalism. So it's on us to step up to the plate and say that this is not right, because again, it's not right because it violates their rights, but it's also not right because of the consequences of going down this road of deciding that it's okay if some journalists are imprisoned or kidnapped or killed or attacked because they work for organizations that some people don't think are completely fact-based, but it's the ones that we've all kind of collectively deemed to be reliable are the ones that deserve our protection. So it's a dangerous and very murky road to go down. But I no doubt, I don't have any examples in my head right now, but I have no doubt that there are news organizations out there, newspapers, outlets that have used their pages or website to sow hate, and to kind of rile people up. As I said before, particularly around religion, I think you see this a lot. The kinds of things that get published in some local papers that probably are either government controlled or only publishing the kinds of things that the government will allow, or very often attack atheists and humanists and free thinkers and say that people who attack religion should be put in prison or killed, and that's really dangerous. I don't think that sort of thing is defensible. But in that situation, we don't have as much of a role to play, because it's not as if there are journalists whose rights are being threatened. It's definitely a dangerous situation. It's not ideal, but it's not something that we necessarily engage on.
So this is actually obviously a really interesting topic, because I still have more questions than we have time left. So I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more, but we'll see how we do. Okay.
Sure.
So the first one here is, what can you tell about how the pendulum swings back to tolerating more press freedoms in a country after episodes like we are in now, when those freedoms are under siege? What has to happen?
Great question. So one of the advocacy methods, one of the ways that we approach the question that this is getting at, is that you, for example, may have an administration or government that has a lengthy history and is known to be aggressive towards the press and attacks journalists, puts journalists in prison. But governments change, elected officials change, people get voted out. Some countries, they don't always get voted out, and they have to die first. But the countries where there's a sliver of democracy left, and there's still somewhat free elections, you can see political change, or there's enough pressure from civil society where people end up stepping down. And the next step is critically important. The organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists that I'm with, has really made it important to engage with any administration that or policymaker that's coming in after there's been a lengthy history of a policymaker or administration that was anti-press, to engage with them and say, you have a chance here to completely distance yourself from the elected official, the official who was just voted out of office or had to step down due to pressure in the country, to position yourself as someone who will come in, restore press freedom protections, and make this country a beacon of press freedom rather than one that people are looking at and saying, that's a place where journalists can't work freely. And so this is something that we've done around the world when you see political change, and it's now something that we're going to do in the United States. In fact, just a few days ago, we published on our website, and I'm happy to share this after the event, but you can go on cpj.org and find it pretty easily. A sort of initial roadmap for the Biden administration to improve press freedom in the United States and outside the United States. Because again, it's important, I think, what's happening in the United States for what journalists here are facing. But it's also really important what's happening in the United States has repercussions for around the world. We are seeing this 600% increase in attacks on journalists in the United States. Well, it's only a matter of time before other governments see this and reference it in to justify their own crackdowns on the press, or to use it to bat the United States over the head and say, you can't come talk to us about this journalist who's in prison here. Look how you're dealing with journalists back home. So it's really critical right now that Congress and the Biden administration push full force on press freedom and restore the U.S. standing in the world.
Okay, so this is going to be our last question. And there was a question about the numbers and the 600%. And I'm sorry to the question, I'm not going to throw that one up here, but sure, I know the website has all that.
If you go to the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, just Google it. Like all that data is there, and it's all broken down.
Right. And so I'm going to go to this last question. This is a broad question relative to WikiLeaks. Can governments protect information? ? Should governments be completely transparent?
I think that's a really difficult question, and we could have had an hour and a half long event on that. Whether governments should be completely transparent. Clearly, there's a degree to which governments need to protect certain information, and I think the number one reason for that is protecting lives. news organizations publishing information on, where U.S. troops are hiding amidst conflict obviously puts lives at risk. And so, there are obviously really, there is information that exists that it's in the government's best interest. And frankly, it's in our best interest because the government's only protecting that information because they're trying to protect people's lives. But I think that the pendulum, speaking of pendulums, has swung way too far over to the other side, which is that the government now has enormous authority to protect information that I don't think protects anyone. And a good example of this is the situation that we're dealing with the case of Jamal Khashoggi. There have been a number of different, advocacy avenues that we've pushed on Jamal's case, but one of them is we're in the midst of fighting a lawsuit right now. We filed a bunch of freedom of information requests with the State Department and the national intelligence apparatus in the United States to get information about whether or not the U.S. intelligence community knew about threats to Jamal Khashoggi before he was killed, and whether or not they warned him of any of those threats, because there's been reporting that they were aware of threats, or that there at least were threats to Jamal's life before he was killed. So we filed these information requests because there's a directive within the U.S. national intelligence community that says they have a duty to warn individuals. You don't have to be an American citizen. Any individual that they have information that your life is at risk, that they've intercepted messages or found, spyware, they have a duty to warn you about it. And so we were trying to get documents related to that duty to warn, and we were rebuffed and told we're not going to get them. So then we actually filed the lawsuit that we were initially with the Knight Foundation on, and we're now going through this case, and the lawyers for the U.S. intelligence community are basically saying these documents, we can't even say that they exist or not. We can't talk about them at all because even talking about them is dangerous. And it's like, why? I mean, if you knew that there were threats to Jamal, or you didn't know there were threats to Jamal and you warned them or not, we have a right to know that, because as an American or any journalist anywhere, you want to know that the U.S. government is taking threats to journalists' lives seriously. I think it's more important that we get this information out than the government keep it secret. And obviously, I think they're trying to keep it secret to protect something that might be damaging to the political landscape. And this is what I was talking about before. You're constantly dealing with issues where the right thing is so abundantly clear, but you're dealing with geopolitical challenges, and it's really difficult to get people to do the right thing in the end.
Thanks so much. I'm going to stop with the questions there. And Michael, this has been really interesting, and I'm really grateful for your time. We always close with a quote. And as Michael mentioned, Thomas Jefferson, there's a kabillion quotes about Thomas Jefferson in the press. He was all over supporting it until it sounds like he didn't. And Benjamin Franklin has some cute ones. You've heard a lot of those. So I picked an unlikely source. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'll tell you who it is at the end. Why should freedom of speech and freedom of the press be allowed? Why should a government which is doing what it believes to be right allow itself to be criticized? It would not allow opposition by lethal weapons. Ideas are much more fatal things than guns. Why should any man be allowed to buy a printing press and disseminate pernicious opinions calculated to embarrass the government? Those words of wisdom are from Vladimir Lenin. Thanks, and I look forward to seeing you in the chat after.